This information you are about to hear and perhaps view, these are not necessarily the thoughts or the ideas of Gary C.Clement or the Gary Clement Radio Show podcast. We are in no way, shape, or form affiliated with the parties this story is about or was interviewed for. Parts of this content may not be owned by or the property of the Gary Clement Radio Show podcast, G2 Network Media, or any other company we are affiliated with, and this information is strictly the opinion of those being interviewed. This content is for information purposes only, and although we may make reference to various news stories, we share our own independent beliefs about the content and provide our own opinions. Please enjoy the information. Yes, this is Gary Clement. This is the Gary Clement Radio Show and podcast. And today our guest is Dr. Philbert Aaron. He's a leadership expert working from Nashville to New York. His focus is on how politicians in the Eastern Caribbean learn how to lead. First of all, just tell me, sir, tell us a little bit about who you are and how you grew up and all of that, please.
Yeah, happy to do that, Gary. Happy to be on your show. Thank you very much. I grew up in the Eastern Caribbean, in the Commonwealth of Dominica. The Eastern Caribbean, those little islands in that arc of islands. So the area is called the Caribbean. That includes the countries on the mainland like Guyana, Belize, and others, and the islands, the chain of islands from Cuba to Trinidad. Well, my portion of islands, they're a little south, closer to Trinidad. They're called the Eastern Caribbean. And in the middle of those is the Commonwealth of Dominica. It's called Dominica. It's not the Dominican Republic. The Dominican Republic is Spanish-speaking, and it's further up north, close to Cuba. But this is the Commonwealth of Dominica. Many of the islands of the Caribbean are now independent, and the majority black populations are similar to the population of the United States. Similar history. In some music, it is said, in Calypso, for example, it is said that the same boat that dropped off our ancestors in the islands dropped off ancestors of African Americans on the mainland. And that is actually true. You can see signs of that on the East Coast, for example, throughout in the architecture and other signs of the past. You can see the similarities with the Caribbean. As a matter of fact, a number of communities were settled from the Caribbean, not just New Orleans, but others up the coast. Well, I grew up on the Commonwealth of Dominica. I was born there, but I've also been educated in West Africa. I went to the University of Benin in Lomé, Togo. I studied French studies there. I did a bachelor's degree there. I did a master's degree in Kansas, in Emporia State University, Kansas, in the United States, and did a PhD in education policy and leadership at the University of Maryland at College Park. I've also worked in Latin America as a diplomat, visited China, have extensive exposure to Europe. And so all those influences make their way into my work, to my reflections.
Mm-hmm. Okay, wonderful. Okay, because I was just sitting here thinking, what makes a person go into something like this? Especially, I consider you somewhat Afro-American, and I'm pretty sure there are not many of you that do this kind of thing. Talk a little bit about that, please.
Yeah. So actually, it's interesting that you asked that question because I'm coming to it from those experiences that I mentioned. So growing up on this tiny island, you start thinking about what surrounds you, the great United States, Europe to the east, Europe and Africa to the east, America to the west. You start reflecting on the differences that you find among cultures. And one of the questions that I had for myself is, why do some societies evolve in one direction? You could call it, why do they develop in a particular way? Why is there economic transformation or great wealth in one and not the other? So these are questions that occupy many people in different fields, in economics, in leadership, in so many areas, in health, because this has impact in so many areas. And these are questions that I have carried with me for a long time. Those questions were answered, for example, in relation to France and Europe. As you know, these societies organized in great cities, large cities, the cities that we know now, hundreds of years ago. So you look at those things, you ask yourself about those questions. You relate also. There is great work done in history and economics in our region of the relationship between the Caribbean, especially slavery in the Caribbean, colonization in the Caribbean, and the wealth of Europe, and to a certain extent, the United States. So historians like Dr. Eric Williams in Trinidad was Prime Minister of Trinidad, advanced that great reflection, that great research on the roots of so many European industries and businesses, precise businesses in the slave trade and colonization. And I'm sure you are aware of that kind of work being done now. Also in the United States, the relationship between the great universities of the United States and their past in the enslavement of African peoples. So that kind of work has been going on in the region in which I was born, the Caribbean, the Eastern Caribbean, and it has impacted my reflections. But most recently, I worked with the leader of the Commonwealth of Dominica. That's the Prime Minister, Prime Minister Roosevelt Skerrit. He's still Prime Minister of the Commonwealth of Dominica. For 10 years, I worked as his ambassador to Venezuela. I was also the public relations officer of his ruling Dominica Labour Party. And this gave me access to information, very intimate data on how the leaders in our region, how they think, what their priorities are, how they set their priorities, what is the relationship between the people they lead and themselves. And so this was a very promising environment in which to look at those difficult questions.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So does it make it easier for you to, how could you say it, be of help or whatnot to other people in your country, as well as, talk to them about things and stuff and help them understand how this political as well as financial breakdown happens or whatnot from country to country?
It does. It does. I must say, however, those are very complicated questions, but they have to be presented in a particular way. So I try to be in my communication not just a scholar, but someone who does public communication. And so I have spoken, and I've written and spoken on the radio and on television, as well as in the media. I have participated in political campaigns, which of course is a place where you try to reach the common listener, common in the sense that not a technical person, but a person who is open to understanding the influences in their daily life, in economics, in politics, and so forth. So it does help, absolutely it does, because it explains and it helps to explain a number of events, a number of phenomena that are happening. People ask themselves always, for example, why is one leader able to lead in a democratic country, of course, meaning why does a leader get re-elected, which permits him to lead for much longer than another? So in the Commonwealth of Dominica specifically, there have been 7 prime ministers since independence, since political independence. So we have a similar tradition to the United States politically. We were colonies of Great Britain. We declared our independence much later. And we chose the path of similar systems to Great Britain. So we have a prime minister, we have a parliament, we have ministers, and so forth. But you ask yourself, in line with this very same inquiry, why do some leaders lead longer? Why do they last longer? Why do the people vote for them repeatedly more so than others? 7 of them in the Commonwealth of Dominica, and 5 of those 7 did not last for 5 years. 5 out of 7 lasted less than 5 years, and 2 lasted more than 5 years, but not just a little more than 5 years. One of those 7 lasted 14 years, 11 months, just about 15 years. And the current prime minister under whom I served is currently in his 19th consecutive year. So he has been re-elected 5 times. That is very interesting compared to term limits at the highest level in the United States, the presidential level. Right. So people ask themselves those questions. People ask, what causes it? What explains it? Is it the person? Is it the man or woman? Is it the job? Is it because he's prime minister? People ask themselves, is it the election system? How people get elected? Do people vote directly or not? Is that the reason? Is it because of the country itself? For example, the size, the small size. So people do have those questions. They may not frame them the way academics and scholars do, but constantly people ask themselves for explanation of these issues, and I work on those issues.
Okay, cool. So to leave America and go back to your country, where the wealth gap is so much different than here in America, what does that, do you have any power, in a sense, over drawing more money to a different country or to one of those other, other areas opposed to being here in America?
Well, yes. Well, so the scale of wealth, of course, is vastly different. This, not, the absolute scale of wealth in a larger country, especially a developed country. My country is smaller. That's one level of difference. My country is also a developing country, a country that has not attained the economic level of development of the United States. 2 huge differences there, and there are others. But one of the major things that is different and is very enlightening for observers from outside is that in the Caribbean overall, and specifically in my Commonwealth of Dominica, the people who determine the social class, who monopolize power, political power in that democracy, they are the working class. And that presents a really different scenario than what obtains in the United States and generally in liberal, industrialized democracies. So we have a working class being the majority, but also politically determining who gets to be prime minister, who gets to parliament, and who leads. And in this case, that working class chooses over the last generation, the last 30, 40 years, has elected somebody from the middle class. Middle class, not upper class, not wealthy, to lead the working class. And what you see is leadership and politics that happens in a completely different way than in a society where the upper class and other types of elites, social elites, education elites, really run the country. So that is something I believe can open the eyes of observers from outside of our region. Here is a society that is dominated politically, not by the wealthy, not by the estate owners, not by the business owners, but by working men and women. And how do they do it? What is different? and so forth. So that is a major difference there.
What do you like about American politics, and what do you dislike about American politics?
American politics is interesting. I like, for example, that there is a great dynamism in it. There is a dynamic discussion. There is a really wide variety of views and a lot of expression of those views. One thing that is really different is the role of elite knowledge in American politics. By that I mean the type of technical discussions on policy, for example, national security policy. That is, are we going to challenge the dominance or the rise of China? What is our relationship to Great Britain? What is our relationship to the Middle East? Those become, because of the size of the United States, because of the structure of the United States, especially around think tanks and universities, research institutions, this contributes. Of course, there are also newspapers and journals which help to create that kind of dynamic. Those discussions, those debates, whether it's on television on Sunday morning, whether it's in the newspaper every day or on weekends, whether it's through debates on public channels, those discussions, those technical discussions are pretty interesting to look at. And our politics is not as technical as that. It's completely different. What I do not like, is something I have observed is the extent to which politics in the United States can become heavily personal, heavily irrational, in the sense that you could, for example, mention certain facts or not very true references and get a huge reaction. That is something that most people are concerned about, and that would include the January 6th storming of the Houses of Parliament. And so that kind of trend, we see that trend, by the way, worldwide, but that trend is disturbing, and it's a cause for concern for many of us who appreciate American democracy.
Mm-hmm. Okay, because one major thing that actually I would say really messed America up was Donald Trump in office. How did that affect your country?
Well, that was really interesting. Of course, the United States, what goes on in the United States comes to the Caribbean and specifically the Commonwealth of Dominica through television. That's one. But also because quite a few Dominican citizens live in the United States, and the views that they are exposed to, they communicate those views to family members, but also to political talk radio. So there are talk shows daily, like there are in many parts of the world now, and frequent callers and high participation from Dominican citizens who are living in the United States. And so the presidency of Donald Trump, just like the presidency of Barack Obama, for example, and others, had a great influence on the politics of Dominica. It's less so now, obviously. But let me just hasten to add that the Commonwealth of Dominica in politics, as is the case in the entire Caribbean mostly, is more left-leaning, is more liberal so trends more towards the current Democratic Party than the Republican Party. So that is a major factor here. So that's the background from which we appreciate and we listen to comment on the politics of the United States. Generally, the countries of the Caribbean are left-leaning, in this case, we would say liberal-leaning, more than conservative. They are left-leaning, they are liberal in relation and in comparison to the United States and Europe. And that colors our appreciation of American politics.
I see. Okay. So what happened in this country or whatnot that really affected Dominica, that you could really, really see it in the air, really feel it in people's voices when they basically talked about it?
Well, for one, the people of Dominica, in listening to and in following American politics, are always interested, especially in immigration policy. Mm-hmm. That's one. Mm-hmm. They're also always interested in security policy. So take security policy, national security, mm-hmm. U.S. national security. Mm-hmm. A few hundred miles south of us is Grenada. Mm-hmm. Grenada, you will recall, was invaded by United States Marines in 1983, mm-hmm. Following the death of Grenada's Prime Minister Maurice Bishop. Mm-hmm. Of course, in the very same region is Cuba, mm-hmm. and we have others. So citizens of the Caribbean, and specifically of the Commonwealth of Dominica, are always sensitive to the posture of United States regimes towards security in that sense, and towards openness ideologically. That is in relation to, at one point, it was the Soviet Union. Currently, it's China. That's on one level. It is also the truth that we are always, we have our eyes on immigration policy. Is it easy to get to the United States? Is it hard to get to the United States? Those two things are important. The economy is also very important. We watch United States economics very well because not only are there, like I said before, Dominican immigrants working in the United States, and of course they send home part of their income, which is important for the economy, especially a small economy. But there are other parts of our economy that work together with the United States economy. For example, tourism. Tourism is large in the economy of the Caribbean. Mm-hmm. It's not as big as it is in the Commonwealth of Dominica. The Commonwealth of Dominica is just evolving towards tourism, but it is still important. And the availability of funding, and especially availability of income for travel, tourist travel to the region, is something Caribbean people, Dominican people look at very, very closely on a daily basis. So national security, immigration policy, the movement in economics, those things are things that Caribbean people and Dominican people consume by whatever means, television, internet, otherwise conversation on a daily basis. We are in tune with the movements there.
Mm-hmm. I see. Okay. American politics has a tendency to be very corrupt. What about in Dominica?
In Dominica, thankfully, as in much of the English-speaking Caribbean, there is not so much a concern for corruption. It doesn't mean you don't hear talk about corruption, because corruption, apart from the fact of corruption, corruption is an interesting political topic. Mm-hmm. That is, to accuse someone of being corrupt is a big political move. And to also brand yourself as being clean is also a huge political asset in the political marketplace. So there is talk of corruption, and here we have to separate the various cultures and political cultures. In our region, as a result of colonization, we have the Spanish-speaking countries, Cuba, Dominican Republic. We have French-speaking territories, Haiti, also Creole-speaking, and we have dependencies of France. And we have the Commonwealth of Caribbean, the dominant in numbers of countries. That's from Jamaica, Trinidad, Dominica, St. Lucia, Grenada, with a British tradition. And in those countries, corruption is not an important fact of life.
Interesting. Okay. So for young people as well as college students interested in getting involved in this political thing, do you see that often now? Are more college students going in this direction?
Well, absolutely. That, I would suggest, is one of the strengths of the democracies of the Commonwealth Caribbean. Of the English-speaking Caribbean, that is an attractive phenomenon. That is how easy it is to enter politics. For example, the Prime Minister of Dominica, the Prime Minister with whom I worked, became Prime Minister of Dominica at age 31. Age 31 is absolutely young. So much so that when he became Prime Minister in 2004, Guinness, the record book and record site, declared him and certified him to be the youngest Prime Minister in the world at the time. But not only was he the youngest Prime Minister in the world at the time, in the history of the job, Prime Minister. So Prime Minister is a global position in that it is there in Great Britain where it started, but it is also there in parliamentary democracies in Africa, in Asia, in the Caribbean. In the history of that position, Prime Minister Roosevelt Skerrit was the second youngest. He was the second youngest ever, because the youngest was aged 24 in England a couple centuries ago. And he was William Pitt, and he was Prime Minister at 24. So this illustrates, one, how easy it is for young people to get involved in politics in the Caribbean and in Dominica. But there are two other aspects to that which I think would interest your listeners. It's the question of social class and education. Education is one of the great barriers to entry into politics in the United States. So, for example, the President Obama, the first and only black president of the United States, in spite of the fact of his racial identity, he had elite education. That is a major requirement for entry into influential positions in the public sector in the United States.
Right.
The Supreme Court, as we know, the members of the Supreme Court are represented there from just a few elite education institutions. Lately, presidents have been the same. MBAs usually, or training in law from elite universities. The opposite is the case in the Caribbean. Yes, prime ministers of the Caribbean, especially the English-speaking Caribbean, may have high-level education. So the Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, a neighboring state, holds a PhD. And a number of prime ministers of the Eastern Caribbean have held PhDs. But it is not a requirement requirement for accessing the top levels of public office, for becoming prime minister. It is not a requirement. And until very recently, education, formal education, higher education was not a requirement at all. So that is very interesting. And the history of it is even more interesting. It goes, my view is, it goes along with the fact that the elite, the political elite, the people who decide who gets into office are working class. And they're working class, so they are not likely to put up barriers to accessing political power. Mm-hmm. So although many people look at higher education and formal education as a whole as some sort of an indication of competence as well as commitment to knowledge, it also serves as a barrier. Mm-hmm. And so in the Eastern Caribbean, as a result of our history, same history here with the United States, that is, the majority of the population is Black, descendants of African enslaved people. And just as in the United States, access to education, formal education, was by law cut off. So it means that this group, this racial group, only got major access to formal education and higher education after emancipation, which happens in the 1830s. And so that group has not been the dominant cultural elite in terms of higher education. It is, there's great effort to change that. So for that group, which is the political elite, they're not the cultural elite. They don't have the finest education. But for that group with political power and monopoly on political power to have put up elite education, meaning elite culture, as a requirement for accessing political office, would have been to hurt itself, at least in terms of access to power. So it is tied to social class. Mm-hmm. And you see a completely different formulation in the United States, as I've mentioned, mm-hmm. where your president, at least most, when I say our president, most recently, coming from the University of Pennsylvania, MBA, coming from Columbia, coming from Harvard, and so forth. It's a completely different setup as a result of the fact that the people, the social class that dominates political power is the working class. So they are not favored in the cultural sphere with elite higher education. They are not favored in the economic sphere with huge sums of money. Mm-hmm. And as a result, the barriers to power are completely different. Now, of course, mm-hmm. all elites defend their turf. The means by which they do it, that varies. But all elites defend their turf. That is, specifically, the working class in the Caribbean that dominates political power uses other means to ensure that it continues to maintain its dominance of politics.
I see.
But it is not predominantly done through money or through elite culture, specifically elite education and higher education. It's done by other means.
I see. Okay. So with your, knowledge of how the system works or whatnot, would you ever run for a political office?
I decided against that a few years ago. As a matter of fact, I decided not to, and instead because of my affiliation with politics. So, like I said earlier, I have participated in politics. I have been an ambassador. I have been a public relations officer of the ruling Dominican Labour Party in Dominica. But a few years ago, more than a few years, I decided instead to concentrate on academic work that could have influence on politics rather than participate directly in politics. Because, first of all, being in politics does not necessarily mean that you can influence the outcomes of certain things. Let me give you an example. Mm-hmm. The transformation of societies. Mm-hmm. It is not automatic that someone who is a member of parliament or even a prime minister is able to radically transform a society because he has political power. Mm-hmm. And so my interest has always been, as a young man, has always been transformation of society, economies, politics, towards much more democracy, towards much more equality, and so forth. And so I decided instead to focus on academic work and practicing politics, machine politics in the party, organization, and so forth, rather than to go for holding political office directly. Mm-hmm. So I'm afraid my chances now, I think that boat has sailed.
I see. Okay, cool. So for those people interested in learning more about your programs, things that you're involved in, and your company, just give us your social media information. Give us how do they basically contact you?
So I am on LinkedIn, for example. I am on LinkedIn. I also have a website dedicated to my work. That's drphilbertaaron.com. That's my name's Philbert Aaron, drphilbertaaron.com. That's my website. I am on Facebook. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Instagram. And people can see my work, see interesting pictures of my involvement in politics and so forth from those sites. You can also contact me by telephone if they wish to. My telephone number is 203-893-2932. Can reach me those ways. My email address is simple. That's my two names at gmail.com. That's Philbert Aaron at gmail.com. Philbert always causes trouble for the American speaker and the American ears. People hear Philip instead of Philbert, but it's Philbert. It's an old British name. It's Philbert, and Aaron is Aaron at gmail.com. So again, you can reach me by email, by telephone. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Instagram, and drphilbertaaron.com is my website.
We really do appreciate our guests who participated in this episode, and we hope you learned something that will bless your day and your life. For all who are interested in learning more about the Gary Clement Radio Show podcast, please visit www.amazon.com and order my book, The Gary Clement Radio Show, When Strong Afro-American Men and Women Stand Up. It covers everything about us and features a variety of Afro-American personalities who speak out about the importance of education and literacy in the Black community. Well, we thank you for tuning into our podcast. Please send us your email address so we can contact you when we have new releases and new episodes and new projects as well. You can reach us at gccpresents@yahoo.com. And also, if you're interested in submitting any materials or want to get in touch with us, please do so by simply sending an email to gccpresents@yahoo.com. That's G as in Gary, C as in Charlie, C as in Charlie, presents@yahoo.com. So until next time, do take care. And this is a G2 Network Media production.